The alien ship hung against the void like a living gemstone, its surface shimmering with a faint iridescence that seemed to shift as the human crew observed it. Commander Dan Trevors stood on the bridge of the Eurythmia, his hands resting lightly on the console before him. Around him, the rest of the crew maintained a low murmur of activity, each member glued to their own workstation. The strange vessel was unlike anything they'd encountered before, a crystalline structure rather than a metallic hull, glowing softly with hues that defied human understanding. Captain Ensign Hollis said from the communications station, her voice crisp. They've accepted her hail. Well, I think it's a delegation. At least, that's the closest word I can find for their response. Dan nodded, glancing toward the science officer, Lieutenant Carter, who was hunched over his data tablet. What's your read on it, Carter? Carter looked up, his brow furrowed. No clear threat signatures. Whatever their technology is made of, it doesn't emit anything resembling weaponized energy. That said, their ship's readings are beyond our sensors' ability to fully decipher. So, Dan said with a small smile, we're going in blind. That's one way to put it, sir, Carter replied. All right, Dan said, adjusting his uniform. Let's proceed cautiously. Ensign Hollis, keep communications open. Commander Chin, you've got the con. I'm taking Carter and a couple of others to meet this delegation. Understood, sir, Chin said, stepping up to the captain's chair as Dan turned and left the bridge. The shuttle ride to the alien vessel was surprisingly short. From the moment their ship docked, it was clear this was no ordinary diplomatic mission. The airlock opened to reveal a corridor that shimmered like the inside of a geode with surfaces that sparkled faintly under the overhead lights. Dan glanced at Carter, whose wide-eyed expression mirrored his own sense of awe. Their escort arrived silently. The Lumari delegation was a group of tall, lithe figures with skin that glimmered like polished quartz. Their movements were smooth, almost liquid, and their eyes glowed softly, a pale silver that seemed to pierce through the humans they gazed upon. Leading them was Kaori, a figure slightly taller than the others, her movements deliberate and her expression unreadable. She wore a garment that appeared to shift colors as she moved, and when she spoke, her voice was low and melodic, though tinged with an unfamiliar rhythm. We greet you, humans, she said, her words remarkably clear, yet delivered without any hint of emotion. You have entered our territory peacefully. We are prepared to discuss terms of mutual benefit. Dan stepped forward. Thank you, Kaori. I'm Commander Dan Trevors, and we appreciate your willingness to meet with us. We come in peace and hope to learn more about your people. Kaori tilted her head slightly. You use many words to say what is clear. We will learn your ways. Dan smiled. And we'll learn yours. That's what this is all about. The initial meeting took place in a chamber that resembled a large, crystalline amphitheater. The humans sat across from the Lumari delegation, separated by a low, transparent barrier that appeared to hum faintly. The Lumari did not use chairs, instead standing in a loose semicircle, their stillness unnerving. Carter set up a small tablet display and began explaining Earth's basic diplomatic protocols. Kaori listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances with her fellow Lumari. They spoke to one another in a language that sounded like chiming bells, a rapid exchange that Carter struggled to translate in real time. Commander, Carter whispered, leaning toward Dan, they're asking about our, sense of unnecessary expressions? I think they mean why we smile, joke, or make small talk. Dan frowned. Unnecessary expressions? They find it inefficient, Carter said. I think they're trying to understand why we don't just state our objectives plainly. Right, Dan said, sitting back. This is going to be interesting. As the meeting progressed, Dan made an effort to simplify his speech, focusing on what the Lumari seemed to value most: clarity, directness, and practicality. But as much as he tried to adapt, he couldn't help being himself. At one point, he attempted a light-hearted remark about the Lumari ship's beauty, only to be met with silence. Kaori's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. Why do you say this? The appearance of our vessel is not relevant to this exchange. It's just a compliment, Dan said with a shrug. A way of showing appreciation for something well-made. Kaori tilted her head. A compliment. I see. Your species values these non-technical observations? It's part of how we build trust, Dan said. It's not all facts and figures. Sometimes it's about showing a bit of humanity. Kaori didn't reply, but her eyes narrowed slightly as if she were processing his words on multiple levels. Later that day, Dan and Carter were escorted to temporary quarters on the Lumari vessel. The chamber was as stunning as the rest of the ship, with walls that glowed faintly and a floor that felt cool and smooth beneath their boots. This place is unreal, Carter said, setting his tablet down. I've never seen materials behave like this. It's like the whole ship's alive. Yeah, Dan said, walking to a large crystalline window that revealed a breathtaking view of the stars. But I can't shake the feeling we're under a microscope. Kaari and her team, they don't miss a thing. Carter nodded. They're trying to understand us, just like we're trying to understand them. But I get the impression their way of thinking is so different, it's hard for them to even relate. That's why we're here, Dan said. We have to find common ground. If they're as advanced as they seem, we could learn a lot from them. And maybe they could learn something from us. As if on cue, the door to their quarters opened and Kaari entered, her tall frame appearing even more elegant under the chamber's light. She inclined her head toward Dan. Commander Travers, I wish to understand something. Dan exchanged a glance with Carter, then stepped forward. What can I help you with? Kaari gestured lightly, as if choosing her words carefully. You said your kind builds trust by expressing appreciation, by offering these compliments. Why is this necessary when the facts of our cooperation are clear? Dan scratched the back of his neck. It's not just about what's clear. It's about connection. We're more likely to work well together if we understand each other not just as diplomats, but as people. That means finding common ground, showing respect, even laughing at the same things. Laughing, Kaari repeated. Her tone was neutral, but there was a slight shift in her expression, a hint of curiosity. Your species finds joy in these interactions? Exactly, Dan said. It helps us feel closer, more comfortable. And when people feel connected, they work together better. Kaari tilted her head again, as if running his words through some complex internal process. I see. This is unfamiliar to us, but I will consider it. Dan stood outside the human delegation's quarters on the Lumari vessel, fiddling with the communicator clipped to his jacket. He wasn't quite sure why he felt so nervous. After all, this was supposed to be a routine cultural exchange, a chance to learn more about the Lumari and maybe share a bit of humanity in return. Yet, every time he thought about their guide for the day, Kaari, his stomach did a little flip. There was something about the way she looked at him, as if she were trying to piece him together one molecule at a time, that made him feel both unsettled and intrigued. Beside him, Lieutenant Carter was tinkering with a portable scanner, his usual furrowed expression in place. They've given us clearance to visit one of their data repositories, Carter said, glancing up. Apparently, it's a central hub for their knowledge-sharing systems. Should be fascinating. Should be, Dan agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Anything we should be careful about? You know, cultural taboos, things we might accidentally say or do. Well, Carter said, adjusting the scanner's settings, from what I've gathered, the Lumari aren't fond of unnecessary verbal expression. Too much small talk might come across as inefficient. But I think Kaari is a bit more flexible than the rest. She seems genuinely curious. Dan nodded. Good. I'll try not to overdo it. The chamber door slid open with a soft hum and Kaari stepped inside. Her silver-gray skin shimmered faintly under the room's gentle light and her luminous eyes fixed on Dan with that same unyielding curiosity. She carried a small, crystal-like device in her hands, which she held out as she approached. This device will allow you to access our repository without interference, she explained in her melodious voice. I will guide you to the location. Dan reached out and took the device carefully, feeling its cool, smooth surface. Thank you, Kaari. We're looking forward to learning more about your culture. Kaari's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her head tilting slightly as if she were processing his words. Then she turned and gestured for them to follow. Come, I will show you. The path to the repository took them through a series of crystalline corridors, each one more dazzling than the last. Carter occasionally stopped to scan the walls, muttering notes into his handheld recorder. Dan tried to keep up, but his attention was divided. Kaari walked ahead of them, her movements smooth and deliberate, and he found himself wondering what she thought of all this. Humans walking through her people's ship, poking at things, asking questions. Kaari, he said, stepping up beside her. What do your people use this repository for exactly? Is it just for storing information, or does it serve another purpose? She glanced at him, her expression as composed as ever. It is our central knowledge hub. All Lumari have access to its contents. We use it to share data, resolve disputes, and ensure that all decisions are informed by the most accurate information available. Dan nodded, impressed. So it's like a library, a courtroom, and a university all rolled into one. Kaari hesitated. Those are human concepts, yes? Libraries, universities, courtrooms. We do not have exact equivalents, but your analogy is acceptable. Thanks, Dan said, smiling. I'll take acceptable. Carter, who had been trailing behind, caught up to them and cleared his throat. Commander, there's something interesting here. The energy readings from these walls. It's not just light refracting through crystal. I don't know. It's like the ship itself is alive. Kari stopped and turned to face him. Alive is not the correct term. Our structures are integrated systems, self-sustaining and adaptive. They are not sentient, but they respond to our needs. That's incredible, Carter said, looking down at his scanner. I've never seen anything like it. Few species have, Kari said simply. She glanced at Dan. Your people are curious. It is an unusual trait. We like to learn, Dan said. Sometimes that means asking questions, even when we don't know what we're looking for. Kari seemed to consider this, then continued walking. This way. When they reached the repository, Dan and Carter were momentarily stunned into silence. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with shimmering panels that seemed to ripple like water. In the center of the room, a massive crystalline column stretched from floor to ceiling, its surface glowing softly as data flowed through it in intricate patterns. Welcome to our knowledge core, Kari said, gesturing toward the column. Everything we know is stored here, accessible to any Lumari who seeks it. Dan stepped forward, holding the small crystal device Kari had given him. And this lets us access it? Yes, Kari said. It will filter the data into a form you can understand. Carter moved closer, his scanner beeping rapidly. This is amazing. Commander, we could spend years here and barely scratch the surface. I think we'll start with a few hours, Dan said with a grin. He turned to Kari. You mentioned that this core also helps you resolve disputes. How does that work? Kari inclined her head. When disagreements arise, we consult the data. The core provides a record of all relevant information, allowing us to make decisions based on precedent and logic. It removes personal bias from the equation. Dan raised an eyebrow. No personal bias at all? Doesn't that make things cold? Maybe a little too detached? Kari's luminous eyes studied him for a moment. To you, perhaps, but to us it is efficient. Decisions made without emotion are often more effective. I see, Dan said, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. Well, efficiency definitely has its place. Carter, still focused on his scanner, suddenly looked up. Commander, I think we can extract some basic cultural data from this. With Kari's permission, of course. Kari regarded him silently for a moment before nodding. You may proceed. The device will guide you. Thank you, Carter said, stepping forward. This is going to take a while. Commander, you might want to talk to Kari while I set this up. Could be a good opportunity to ask about, well, anything. Dan nodded. Good idea. He turned to Kari. Mind if we step aside for a bit? I'd like to learn more about your people, beyond the data. Kari tilted her head. What would you like to know? Dan gestured toward the far side of the room, where they could talk without disturbing Carter's work. Kari followed, her movements graceful as ever. Once they were alone, Dan took a moment to gather his thoughts. Your culture values logic and efficiency above all else, he said. But there has to be more to it. What about art, music, storytelling? How do you express yourselves? Kari looked at him, her expression inscrutable. Our art is precise. Our music is structured. Our storytelling is methodical. To you, it may seem restrained. To us, it is beautiful in its clarity. Dan smiled faintly. I'd love to experience it sometime. Maybe you could show me something. Music, a piece of art. Something that's meaningful to you. Kari considered his request, then nodded. I will arrange it, but in return, you must share something meaningful from your culture. Something that represents who you are. Dan chuckled. Fair trade. I'll think of something. They rejoined Carter, who was still engrossed in his work. The glowing column pulsed softly as data flowed through the crystal device and into the portable scanner. This is incredible, Carter said without looking up. Commander, I think we can get a basic overview of their cultural history, technological development, even their first contact protocols. This is a gold mine. Good, Din said. Let's focus on gathering as much useful information as we can. But remember, we're not just here to collect data. We're here to build a relationship. Kaori's gaze shifted to Dan, and for the first time, he thought he saw a hint of something that wasn't purely analytical. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was understanding. Either way, he felt a small flicker of hope that they were starting to bridge the gap between their worlds. Dan adjusted his uniform and glanced at Carter, who was carefully arranging a series of data pads on the table. The room was quieter than usual, an open chamber aboard the Lumari ship with walls that glimmered faintly under a soft, crystalline light. They had set up this informal meeting space in an effort to deepen their understanding of the Lumari's culture. Dan wasn't entirely sure how this would go, but Kaori had accepted the invitation, and that was a start. "She'll be here any minute," Dan said, his voice low. "You ready?" Carter looked up, a wry smile crossing his face. "Ready as I'll ever be. I hope this approach works." "We'll see," Dan replied, just as the door at the far end of the room slid open. Kaori entered with her usual poise, her luminous silver-gray skin catching the light as she approached. She was alone, carrying a small crystalline device that resembled a delicate, glowing orb. Her expression was calm, but her eyes, those luminous, ever-curious eyes, seemed to take in everything at once. "Kaori," Dan said, stepping forward, "thanks for coming." "I am curious," she replied, inclining her head slightly. "What do you wish to show me?" Dan gestured to the table where Carter was already powering up the datapads. "We thought it might help if we gave you a more personal look at our history, culture, and, well, how we see the universe. Something beyond facts and figures." Carter chimed in, "It's a lot more visual, more interactive. We can walk you through it together, answer any questions." Kaori tilted her head, regarding the setup with interest. "I see. Proceed." Dan moved to the first datapad, which displayed a rotating image of Earth as seen from space. The familiar blue marble slowly turned, clouds swirling over oceans and continents. "This is our home," Dan said. "Earth. Everything started here." Kaori studied the image closely, then glanced at Dan. "Your species evolved on a planet with such diverse environments. This is rare among the civilizations we have encountered." Carter jumped in. "It's one of the reasons we developed such a wide range of cultures, languages, and ways of thinking. Each environment shaped us differently." Kaori touched the surface of the datapad, causing it to shift to a series of images. Ancient ruins, bustling cities, vast deserts, dense forests. "Your species adapts quickly," she observed. "But these images also show conflict and destruction. This duality is puzzling." "It's a big part of who we are," Dan admitted. "We've had our share of challenges, times when we didn't handle things well. But we've also accomplished a lot, learned from our mistakes." Kaori looked at him directly. "Your species values learning through failure. This is unusual." "We don't always enjoy failing," Dan said with a wry grin. "But it's taught us to keep trying, to look for new solutions." She nodded slightly as if considering his words. "Interesting. Continue." Carter tapped another pad, and the display shifted to Earth's achievements in science and technology. Early steam engines, the first spacecraft, advances in medicine. "We've always been driven to explore," Carter explained, "to push boundaries, learn more about the universe, and to connect with others," Dan added, glancing at Kaori. "That's part of why we're here. To understand your people, to find common ground." Kaori regarded the rotating image of the International Space Station. "Connection," she said slowly, as if testing the word. "Your species values cooperation. When we do it right, yes," Dan said. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it." She studied him for a moment longer, then turned back to the display. "And what do you hope to gain from cooperation with my people?" Dan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Knowledge, understanding, a chance to learn from your perspective. And maybe, together, we can accomplish something neither of us could on our own." Kaori's luminous eyes met his, and for a moment, it felt as if the room itself grew still. Then she nodded again. "A logical objective." Carter tapped. Tell stories and find meaning in our lives." Kaori examined the shifting visuals. "You create for more than function," she said softly. "You create to feel." "Exactly," Dan said. "It's how we share who we are, what we've been through. It's another way to connect." Kaori reached out, her hand hovering over a depiction of a painter working on a vast mural. "You find value in the intangible." "Yes," Dan said. Sometimes the most important things aren't physical. They're ideas, feelings, experiences. She looked at him again, her gaze steady. Your species is complex. I will need time to fully understand. Dan smiled. That's fine. We're not in a hurry. As they wrapped up the presentation, Carter began packing up the data ads, but Dan stayed by the table, leaning against the edge as he watched Kaori. She hadn't left yet. In fact, she seemed almost hesitant, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Kaori, he said, breaking the silence. Was this helpful? She met his gaze. It was enlightening. I now see that your species values more than logic and efficiency. There is a depth to your actions. Dan felt a small flicker of encouragement. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share more, answer any questions. She tilted her head slightly. You speak as if you want to build trust. Is this correct? It is, Dan said. Trust takes time, but it's the foundation of any good relationship, whether between people or between civilizations. Kaori seemed to consider this, her expression calm but thoughtful. You wish to establish a connection not only through knowledge, but through understanding. That's right, Dan said. Because understanding makes cooperation stronger. For the first time, Kaori's lips curved ever so slightly, not quite a smile, but close. You are persistent, Commander Travers. Maybe, Dan said, grinning. But only because I think it's worth it. Later, as they made their way back to their quarters, Carter nudged Dan lightly. You really got through to her. Maybe, Dan said. She's opening up at least a little. Carter smirked. More than a little. I saw that look she gave you. What look? Dan asked, playing dumb. Come on, Carter said with a laugh. She's warming up to you. And I don't just mean diplomatically. Dan chuckled, shaking his head. It's not about that. It's about building trust, understanding each other. Sure, Carter said, giving him a knowing grin. Whatever you say, Commander. The meeting room aboard the Eurythmia was a far cry from the glittering, crystalline chambers of the Lumari vessel. Its gray walls and muted lighting seemed almost dull in comparison, but Dan found the familiarity comforting. He leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed, as Carter set up a series of data displays. It had been a long day of discussions, cultural exchanges, and a few awkward moments, but there was progress, real progress. Kaori sat across from them, her luminous eyes focused on the holographic display that Carter was adjusting. Her silver-gray hands rested lightly on the table, still as a statue. She always carried herself with a calm poise, as if no situation could truly rattle her. Dan admired that, though he also wondered what lay beneath that composed exterior. There were moments, fleeting, barely perceptible, when her gaze lingered just a bit longer than necessary or her voice softened ever so slightly. All right, Carter said, stepping back. That should do it. The program is set up to integrate our historical data with the Lumari system. We can cross-reference your records with ours in real time. Kari's head tilted slightly. A commendable effort. This will allow for greater transparency in our interactions. That's the idea, Dan said. The more we share, the more we'll understand each other. Kari's gaze shifted to him. You place great emphasis on mutual understanding. Why? Dan hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Because that's how we build trust. And without trust, we can't truly work together. Kari regarded him silently. Trust. This concept is less central to Lumari interactions. We rely on verified data and consistent logic. Carter jumped in. But even your people must have a way of knowing who to rely on, right? You have advisors, decision-makers, there's got to be some level of faith in their judgment. Kari considered this. Faith is not the correct term. It is a calculation based on past actions and proven outcomes. Dan nodded. In a way, that's not so different from how we approach trust. It's just that we factor in emotions, personal experiences, and sometimes gut feelings. Gut feelings, Kari repeated, the words sounding foreign in her melodic voice. You make decisions based on intuition rather than data? Not always, Dan clarified. But sometimes intuition helps us see patterns we can't immediately quantify. It's not perfect, but it's part of who we are. She watched him intently, as if weighing his words. Your species is adaptive. You incorporate logic and emotion, calculation and intuition. This is unique. Carter smirked. I think you're starting to get the hang of human complexity. Kari's lips curved ever so slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Dan took it as a positive sign. It is a process. As the hours passed, the three of them worked together, sifting through data and comparing notes on their respective histories. Carter took the lead on the technical side, ensuring that the systems remained compatible. Kari provided insight into Lumari records, translating the crystalline patterns into something humans could understand. Dan, for his part, facilitated the discussions, steering the conversation whenever it began to drift into overly technical territory. They were deep into a discussion about early human space exploration when Carter finally sat back with a satisfied sigh. "All right, I think that covers the basics. Kari, I have to admit, your records are, well, incredible. The level of detail, the organization, it's unlike anything we've seen." Kari inclined her head. "Your enthusiasm is noted. However, I must also acknowledge the depth of your species' historical records. Your ability to document events, even those marked by conflict, is impressive." "Thanks," Carter said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess we've had a lot of practice." Dan glanced at Kari. "We've definitely had our share of challenges. But we've also learned that understanding where we came from helps us decide where we're going." Kari studied him. "Your perspective is evolving. When we first met, your focus was on establishing functional agreements. Now, you seem more concerned with building a deeper connection." "Building a connection is what those agreements are for," Dan said. "The whole point is to create something that lasts, something we can both rely on. An enduring partnership," Kari said slowly, as if testing the phrase. "This is not a concept the Lumari have emphasized. But I see the logic in your approach." Carter stretched his arms and yawned. "I hate to break up the philosophical chat, but I think we've earned a break. What do you think, Commander?" Dan nodded, then turned to Kari. "Would you like to join us in the mess hall? It's not as fancy as your ship's dining area, but the food's decent." Kari hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "I am curious." "Very well." The mess hall was bustling with activity, filled with crew members chatting, eating, and taking a moment to relax. Dan led Kari and Carter to a table near the far wall, away from the noisier groups. The cafeteria-style setup was simple: metal trays, standard-issue utensils, and a variety of earth dishes served from steaming containers. Dan grabbed a tray and looked at Kari, who stood beside him, her head tilted slightly as she examined the scene. "Anything catch your eye?" Dan asked. Kari's gaze lingered on a tray of roasted vegetables. "These appear suitable." "Good choice," Dan said, loading a plate for her. He handed it over, then filled his own tray with a mix of protein and grains. Carter, meanwhile, grabbed a pile of pasta and plopped into a seat. Once they were seated, Dan watched as Kari examined her food. She picked up a fork and held it delicately, turning it this way and that before carefully spearing a piece of vegetable. She placed it in her mouth and chewed slowly, her expression unreadable. "Well?" Dan prompted. Kari swallowed and considered. "It is acceptable. The texture is unusual, but the flavor is pleasing." Dan grinned. High praise from a Lumari. Kari's lips curved slightly. "Perhaps." Carter, mouthful of pasta, chimed in. "You're fitting right in, Kari. Next thing you know, you'll be requesting Earth coffee." Kari raised an eyebrow. "Coffee?" Dan laughed. "Let's start with something simple. If you like this, maybe we'll introduce you to dessert next." The conversation flowed more naturally as they ate. Kari asked questions about Earth's culinary traditions while Dan and Carter shared anecdotes about their time in space. Dan found himself relaxing more around her, the earlier formality giving way to a genuine exchange of ideas and experiences. "You're curious about us," Dan said at one point. "What about you? What's something about the Lumari that you think we should know, something beyond the technical and logical?" Kari hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "We value clarity and order," she said. "But we also have a profound appreciation for harmony. It is not the same as what you call emotion, but it is a balance. A sense that all things should align." Dan nodded, intrigued. "Sounds like you're describing a kind of peace." "Not peace," Kari said softly. "Equilibrium." "That's beautiful," Dan said. "It's not so different from what we strive for in our own way." Kari's gaze lingered on him. "Your species is more complex than I anticipated." "So are yours," Dan replied. "And that's what makes this so important. Learning from each other, finding those points of connection." Kari's lips curved again, and this time it felt more like a genuine smile. "Your persistence is noted." "Just doing my job," Dan said lightly, but the warmth in her gaze stayed with him as they finished their meal.